The mahogany table stretched farther than it needed to, polished so perfectly it caught the reflection of the chandelier's light in fractured gold. Crystal glasses trembled with the faint hum of conversation until my father's palm slammed down hard enough to rattle the silverware. "You're not my daughter," he said. The words didn't rise, didn't shout. They landed flat, heavy, and final, the way a judge might read a verdict. My mother's lips curled not in shock, but in something sharper. Satisfaction. Her eyes didn't even meet mine. They slid past me like I was a stranger. Around the table, chairs creaked as uncles, cousins, and half-brothers shifted in their seats, some pretending to check their watches, others exchanging quick glances that burned hotter than the whiskey in their glasses. No one said my name. I stared at the base of my water glass, tracing the condensation with my thumb. Under the table, my right hand curled so tightly into my palm, I could feel the nail marks carving crescents into my skin. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. The Brooks family had always been good at performances, polite smiles, calculated pauses, insults hidden inside compliments. But this wasn't wrapped in silk. This was bare steel, cold and deliberate. Aunt Margaret shifted beside me, her perfume something expensive with too much vanilla filling the air. She didn't look at me. No one did. My father took a slow sip of his Bordeaux, as though the moment deserved a toast. "This meeting is for family," he added casually, as if explaining why the neighbor's dog couldn't come inside. The statement hung in the air, erasing me with the ease of a pencil line across paper. I heard the faint chime of the grandfather clock in the corner. The sound felt louder than it should, echoing through the pause my father left for me to respond. But I gave him nothing, not a protest, not a plea, just silence. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted, not a crack, but a quiet rearranging of walls I'd been leaning on for years. I didn't come here for their approval, and now I was certain I would leave with something far more valuable. I didn't move. My chair stayed anchored to the floor, my hands folded neatly in my lap now, as though the act of rearranging them could hide the tension vibrating through my body. When I was a child, I used to think silence was a weakness, a void waiting to be filled. Tonight, I learned it could be a weapon. My father's words were meant to provoke, to draw me into a scene he could control. I refused to give him the performance. Across the table, my mother leaned in to whisper something to my brother, her pearls catching the light with each tilt of her head. He smirked, not at me, but at whatever private joke they'd decided I was the punchline to. The smell of roasted duck and truffle butter drifted from the serving cart, a luxury I once would have savored. Now it felt almost absurd. Here we were, slicing into plates that cost more than my monthly rent, while my existence was being dissected like a footnote in the family's history. I let my eyes wander not to faces, but to objects. The cut glass decanter of scotch at the far end of the table, the way the candlelight flickered against the polished silver. These things would outlast this meeting, outlast the people who owned them. The thought steadied me. Someone cleared their throat. Uncle Charles, maybe, though I didn't look up. "Well, shall we move on?" he said, like the last 5 minutes had been a minor hiccup in a dinner party. My father gave a single nod, satisfied the moment was over. But it wasn't. Not for me. Beneath my calm exterior, the memory of another silence returned my high school graduation, scanning the crowd for my family, finding only empty seats where their faces should have been. That same hollow had opened up in my chest then too, and just like tonight I'd smiled through it, hiding the sting so well that people mistook it for composure. I reached for my glass of water, my reflection warped by the curved crystal. I didn't look like a threat. That was good. Let them keep believing it, because the less they saw coming, the more it would shake them when it arrived. The conversation at the table shifted, as if nothing had happened. My father asked my brother about his upcoming corporate merger, leaning in with the kind of pride I'd never seen directed at me. My mother chimed in to praise my sister's latest real estate acquisition, describing it like a political campaign speech, bullet points and applause lines ready. That was the rhythm of this family. Spotlight for some, shadow for others. I'd grown up in that shadow, watching them measure worth in net gains and legacy holdings. My brother's milestones were celebrated with champagne toasts. My sister's successes earned her designer handbags and glowing posts on the family's private social media group. And me? I was the odd one out, the kid who spent afternoons sketching in the garden instead of networking at the country club, who turned down an internship at my father's firm to take a research assistant job at a small environmental nonprofit. A phase, my mother had called it, as if integrity were a passing interest like yoga or pottery. The divide deepened over the years. At my college graduation, my family skipped the ceremony for a charity gala in Palm Beach. "We're so proud of you," my mother had texted that morning, attaching a photo of her sequin dress. Even then, I'd learned to read the subtext. We care, but not enough to show up. Now, sitting at this long table under the chandelier's glow, I realized nothing had changed. The same hierarchy played out before me, louder this time, sharper. I was here physically, but in their eyes, I'd already been erased. I remembered my grandfather, the only one who never treated me like a variable to be managed. He'd once told me, "You're not in their race, kid. That's why they can't see you." At the time, I thought he meant I was falling behind. Now I knew better. The rest of the family laughed at some inside joke I wasn't meant to catch. I smiled faintly into my water glass, my reflection fractured by the crystal. They thought they knew the whole script. They didn't realize my part hadn't even started yet. It was the way my father's words landed tonight, so casual, so certain, that pulled me back to another moment I'd tried to bury. I was 20 then, home from college for the summer. My grandfather had been sick for months, though I didn't know how bad it was. I'd been trying to visit, but every time I called, my mother told me it wasn't a good day. "He's resting," she'd say. Or, "The doctors are here. It's not the right time." One afternoon in July, I stopped by unannounced. Vanessa, my sister, opened the door, her expression too quick to shift from surprise to disdain. "No one's home," she'd said, leaning against the frame like a bouncer outside a club. I remember glancing over her shoulder and swearing. I saw the shape of our grandmother through the frosted glass of the hallway. But I left. Later, I found out they'd told my grandparents I'd moved away without leaving a number, that I didn't want to be bothered with family matters. When my grandfather passed, I was told the funeral was at noon. I arrived at the church just before 11, wanting to be early. The parking lot was empty. Inside, the pews were bare, the flowers already wilting. I sat alone in that cold silence until a custodian told me the service had been at 9. They'd told everyone I hadn't shown up, that I didn't care. That was the first time I felt something in me harden, not out of anger, but out of clarity. They weren't just neglectful, they were deliberate. The distance between us wasn't an accident, it was engineered. I never confronted them. What good would it have done? A family that rewrote the truth could always write you out entirely. So I learned to keep my own records, in journals and in memory, like an archivist of the life they pretended I didn't live. And now, here I was, years later, sitting at this table while they played the same game in front of an audience. They thought I'd walk away empty again. But they'd forgotten something my grandfather once told me on his porch, his voice low and certain. When the truth comes for them, it won't knock. The last time I saw my grandfather alive, it wasn't planned. I'd just finished a late shift at the nonprofit, still in my worn sneakers and coffee-stained hoodie, when I found myself driving toward his house instead of home. I didn't even call ahead, part of me expecting no one would answer. But he did. He opened the door slowly, leaning on his cane, thinner than I remembered, but with that same sharp glint in his eyes. "Well," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Look who still knows the way." Inside, the house smelled like cedar and lemon oil, the way it always had. The late afternoon light pooled through the lace curtains, turning the dust in the air into slow-moving constellations. He led me to the kitchen, poured tea into 2 mismatched mugs, and asked about my work. I told him about a community project we were launching, rehabbing abandoned lots into gardens. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his hands wrapped around his mug like he was holding on to the warmth. After a long pause, he said, "You've always built things they couldn't see. That's why they've never valued them. Or you. I looked down at my tea, unsure what to say. He set his mug aside, rose with a deliberate slowness, and disappeared down the hallway. When he came back, he was holding a small envelope and a leather-bound notebook, the corners worn smooth. "You might need these someday," he said, placing them in my hands. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "Not today, not tomorrow, but when the time comes, you'll know." I didn't open them then. I didn't ask what was inside. Some instinct told me the timing mattered as much as the contents. When I left that evening, he hugged me longer than usual, the kind of embrace that makes you realize someone's saying more with their arms than they ever could with words. I didn't know it would be the last time. Now, sitting at this long, gleaming table years later, I could almost feel the weight of that envelope again, like it had been quietly waiting in the wings for this exact moment. After my grandfather passed, I kept working the same way. I always had quietly, persistently, in the background, where no one from my family bothered to look. I didn't have their kind of capital, but I learned to make things grow with less. By day, I coordinated community grants and stretched every dollar until it felt like 10. By night, I took freelance consulting jobs, small nonprofits that needed strategy, not flash. My apartment was a one-bedroom above a bakery, and the scent of fresh bread in the mornings felt more like luxury than anything I'd ever tasted at the Brooks estate. I built a network, not the kind my father admired, full of CEOs and senators, but a web of people who actually showed up when things got hard. Teachers who wanted playgrounds resurfaced. Retired carpenters who volunteered their weekends. Teenagers who learned to grow tomatoes in soil they'd once thought was only good for broken glass. I didn't post about it. I didn't send out newsletters. Success, I'd decided, didn't need to be a press release. Occasionally, at holiday gatherings, my absence from the big family news was treated like a flaw. "Still doing that little charity work?" an aunt would ask between sips of wine. My brother once suggested I rebrand myself, maybe start wearing more designer clothes, so people take you seriously. I'd smile, nod, and let them believe I was harmless. Let them think I was small. But every project completed, every plot of land restored, every volunteer trained it all, stacked quietly, brick by brick. I began to recognize the same pattern my grandfather must have seen. You don't need their approval to build something that lasts. You just need time, and the discipline to keep going when no one's watching. There were nights I'd open the top drawer of my desk and see that envelope he'd given me. I never opened it. Not yet. But I'd rest my hand on it sometimes, feeling its weight like a reminder. When the time comes, you'll know. And I suspected that time was getting closer. The family meeting had been moving along like any other long-winded updates about trust funds, new properties, and who was invited to which charity gala. My father presided over it like a boardroom, his voice steady, his wine glass always half full. I stayed quiet, letting their conversations flow around me like I was just part of the furniture. But then, somewhere between the announcement of my sister's new investment property and my brother's latest stock win, I noticed the air change. A subtle shift, like the moment before a summer storm, when the light outside turns a shade too still. It started with my grandmother's entrance. She wasn't supposed to be here. She'd avoided these meetings for years, claiming her health or her schedule as an excuse. But now she stepped into the room with slow, deliberate movements, leaning on her cane. Her eyes didn't scan the table. They went straight to me. "I've asked Mr. Harrow to join us," she said, her voice clear enough to cut through the low hum of conversation. The room stilled. Mr. Harrow, my grandfather's lawyer, appeared in the doorway, carrying a worn leather briefcase. I hadn't seen him since the funeral. My father's expression tightened. "Mother, this is hardly the time." "This is exactly the time," she interrupted, lowering herself into the empty chair beside me. "There are matters your father's been avoiding for too long." The cousins exchanged glances. My brother leaned back, smirking like he expected a minor family squabble. Mr. Harrow placed his briefcase on the table, unfastened the brass locks, and withdrew a single, thick envelope sealed in wax. The sight of it made something deep in my chest tighten. He rested it in front of him but didn't touch it again. "This was left in my custody by Walter Brooks," he said, glancing briefly at me before continuing, "with explicit instructions about when and with whom it should be opened." The chandelier light caught the edge of the red wax, making it gleam. My father reached for his wine, but his grip looked tighter now, his knuckles pale. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just waited, because I finally knew this was the moment my grandfather had been preparing me for. Mr. Harrow didn't rush. He broke the wax seal with a careful twist of his wrist, as though he knew the room was strung tight and ready to snap. My father's gaze locked on the envelope. My mother kept her eyes fixed on the linen napkin in her lap, twisting it slowly. The letter inside was handwritten broad, steady strokes I recognized instantly. My grandfather's hand. "To my granddaughter," Mr. Harrow began, his voice calm but carrying easily across the table. The sound of silverware being set down, chairs shifting, the subtle noises of people bracing. "You were always the quiet one, the one they underestimated because you didn't perform for their approval." I felt my mother's posture stiffen. "I saw how you were left out, told you didn't belong. I saw how your voice was dismissed, your presence minimized." Across from me, my brother's smirk faltered. "They chose the familiar path. You chose your own. And though it made you an outsider in their eyes, in mine, it made you the one most capable of carrying forward what matters." The room's oxygen seemed to thin. "That is why I leave to you the Whitman Annex, all associated accounts, patents, and the remaining financial holdings not bound to existing trusts. It is yours alone, no oversight, no approval required. Build what you wish. Do not let them take it from you." A ripple of whispers darted around the table. My father's jaw tightened. My sister's eyes darted to our parents, then back to me, as if willing me to look away. But I didn't. I held Mr. Harrow's gaze as he folded the letter and slid it toward me across the polished wood. "Your grandfather asked me to read this in front of the family," he said. "He wanted there to be no doubt." I rested my hand on the letter, feeling the weight of the paper, the faint texture of his pen strokes beneath my fingertips. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the low, steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. And in that silence, I realized the balance in this room had already shifted. It didn't take long for the tone to change. My father was the first to break the silence, leaning forward with a forced smile. "If we'd known the annex was operational, we could have coordinated with the family trust. There are synergies, ways we could help you scale." "Help me," the same man who, 20 minutes ago, had publicly declared I didn't belong. My sister jumped in, her voice sugary and bright. "We're hosting a healthcare summit next month. Your work could be a perfect feature. Imagine the press, it would be great for you." I let them speak, their words tumbling over each other like a sales pitch neither wanted to lose. My mother reached across the table, placing her perfectly manicured hand over mine. "Sweetheart, we were just worried. Startups fail and we didn't want to see you hurt. You have to understand." I slid my hand back slowly. "No," I said, my voice low but steady. "You weren't worried about me. You were embarrassed by me." My brother let out a short laugh, trying to cut the tension. "Come on, you know we were just teasing over the years." I turned to him. "You mean diminishing me until I stayed small enough not to threaten your version of the family story?" The smirk vanished. I let my gaze sweep the table. "You never asked what I built, never cared enough to know. Yet now that you see a number attached to it, suddenly I'm not an outsider. Now I'm an asset." No one spoke. The annex, the accounts, the patents, they're mine. They'll stay that way. I won't be folding them into your trust, and I won't be lending them to polish the family's image. My father's eyes narrowed. "That's not a wise. It's not negotiable," I cut in, still calm. "The only thing that's changed tonight is how you see me. Not who I am, and certainly not where I stand." I tucked the letter into my bag, the soft sound of the zipper loud in the silence that followed. For once, they didn't have a script. I left the meeting without looking back. The echo of my heels against the marble hallway followed me out to the crisp evening air, where the smell of rain clung to the wind. The streetlights flickered in the wet pavement, each step carrying me farther from their orbit. Over the next weeks, I began to set things in motion. The annex wasn't just a building, it was possibility. I met with its staff, reviewed the ongoing projects my grandfather had quietly funded, and expanded the programs to reach more communities. We launched scholarships for kids whose families had written them off, grants for innovators no one would take seriously until they succeeded. I didn't put my name on the press releases. The work wasn't about recognition, it was about making sure someone else wouldn't have to wait years for the validation they deserved. One evening, alone in my office, I took out my grandfather's letter again. The edges were already softening from how often I'd unfolded it. I read it slowly, not because I didn't know the words, but because each time they seemed to take root a little deeper. Build what you wish. Do not let them take it from you. I slipped the letter into a simple frame and placed it on the corner of my desk not as a trophy, but as a compass. A few days later, I walked through the annex's community garden. The air was thick with the scent of basil and wet soil after the morning watering. Children darted between the rows, holding up strawberries like they'd discovered treasure. A retired carpenter was teaching a teenager how to build a trellis, their laughter spilling into the warm air. I stood there for a long time, letting the sounds and smells fill the spaces that used to hold only silence. This was mine not because it was given to me, but because I had chosen it, built it, and protected it. And for the first time in years, I realized I didn't just feel outside of their family. I felt entirely free from it.